Hi there, I'm Jim Bradley. I write a blog called Under the Castor Oil Tree. I didn't record any of it last week because everything I had written that week was so overtly political because of what happened in Washington. And this week I have a couple of older things um, that I reprinted from my documents. That I have tons and tons of documents. And this one was a sermon on the Children's Sabbath. Children's Sabbath is a way of celebrating children. And we did it all the time when I was at St. John's in Waterbury, Connecticut. It's from 2001, and it was right after uh, the 9/11 attack. And so there's something in it that spoke to me about what's been going on in our country for the past week and a half. Children's Sabbath. Today's lesson from Genesis is the story of Jacob wrestling with an angel. All through the night, Jacob holds on for dear life in his wrestling match. As dawn breaks, the angel damages Jacob's hip, but still Jacob will not let go. He demands a blessing from his enemy and adversary, and instead gets a new name. Jacob becomes known from that day and forever as Israel. And besides a new name, Jacob, now known as Israel, will always walk with a limp. A new name, a new sense, lease on life, a new identity, a new start. None of that comes cheap or easy. To be born again requires a death. A new name comes with a limp. When my children were smaller, Josh was 6 or 7 and Mimi was 3 or 4, we would end many of our days with a wrestling match in our living room at 612 Chapel Street in New Haven. We lived in a huge house that had lots of room for wrestling, and we took advantage of the space. I would always be Andre the Giant, and Josh and Mimi would be Spaghetti and Meatball. Josh was Spaghetti because he was long and lean, and Mimi, who had since grown into a beautiful woman, was Meatball because she was short and round as a child. And we would wrestle for an hour and so until I was gasping for breath and the children were worn out and ready for bed. Often because they were so energetic and I was so much bigger than them, one or the other would get hurt and they would get a limp. They wouldn't stop wrestling though. The wrestling itself was worth the pain it inadvertently caused. One more story because before I try to make sense of all this. And the story is this. It is one of my earliest memories, perhaps my earliest memory. My father and mother and I were in the yard of my Uncle Russell's house. My father was lying down in the grass with me when a stranger came running across the yard toward us. My father leaped up and ran toward him. The two men, my father and the stranger, grabbed each other and wrestled. I wasn't yet 2 years old, but the image of those two men struggling terrified me. I started crying, and my mother rushed to pick me up. But she was crying too, just like me. And my father and the stranger fell to the ground, wrapped in mortal combat. I clung to my mother with great fear. But it wasn't combat at all, I was saying. And my mother's tears were tears of joy, not fear. The stranger who was wrestling with my father was my Uncle Dell, who had been away for a long time. And they weren't wrestling at all. They were embracing, but in the exuberance of their hug, it caused them to rock back and forth and then fall to the ground. Today is the Children's Sabbath. For years now, we at St. John's have celebrated this Sunday of the year as the Children's Sabbath. And never before has observed serving a Sabbath for children been so important, so vital, so necessary, so appropriate, so needed. The English word Sabbath is derived from the Hebrew noun Shabbat and means literally rest. The Sabbath is a day of rest. It is a day reserved for God and for God alone. Orthodox Jews refrain from any work at all on the Shabbat. They do not drive cars or operate machinery or cook or even turn on light switches. The food for Shabbat must be cooked before sunset the day before. The lights must be left on. The family must walk to the synagogue for the prayers. The day belongs to God and God alone. The children's Sabbath is meant to reflect that commitment to God. This day we must belong to the children and to God, to the children and God alone. There are a multitude of children we are called to remember this day. The children of our world are not responsible for the crises that surround us. Today we must find a prayer for all children and rest from the weariness of the world. When thousands died on 9/11, it left a multitude of children without a mother or father or both. The September 11 orphans need rest from their mourning and their loss, a time for God to heal them and for us to open our hearts to them. There are tens of thousands living in poverty and war in Afghanistan. Those children are not responsible for the decades of fighting or the numbing poverty of that land. They need rest from their senseless suffering, a time for God to strengthen them, and we need to open our hearts to them. Hundreds of thousands of Muslim children living in the West, in our nation, in our community, are suffering ridicule and violence merely because of their ethnicity and faith. They need rest from their torment, a time for God to guard them, and we need to open our hearts to them. The events of the past 6 weeks haunt the dreams of millions of children in this country. Their world has been invaded by violence they had not known before. They need rest from their fears, a time for God to comfort them, and we need to open our hearts to them. Our culture romanticizes childhood in a remarkable and dangerous way. We tend to think of the years of childhood as simple and carefree and happy. For the most part, and for most children, that is not true. For the most part, childhood is a nightmare. Children have no power, no control. Children are innocent victims of a grown-up world. Children do not pilot airplanes into buildings. Children do not make war and cause poverty. Children do not abuse and neglect adults. The night of terror for children is all our doing, the result of the actions and decisions of adults. Childhood is a nightmare. That is why fairy tales speak so powerfully to children. In fairy tales, there is a struggle between good and evil. In fairy tales, the weak and defenseless triumph over the monsters and giants and ogres. You know, didn't you, who the monsters and giants and ogres are? They are the big people, the adults who have absolute control over children, the adults who create the terror of children's nightmares. Sabbath is a time for rest, a time that belongs to God and God alone, and to God's precious children. This holy Sabbath, this holy children's Sabbath, speaks to the big people, to the monsters, giants, and ogres, to the adults of the world. And this holy sacred time that belongs to God and to children calls us to open our hearts to the children in our family, in our church, in our community, in our world. They are our responsibility. It is our job and sacred duty to teach the children to wrestle. Spaghetti and meatballs always defeated the awesome Andre the Giant. Just like in fairy tales, Josh and Mimi always won against all odds. That is part of what we must teach our children, that God is on the side of the underdog, the weak, the powerless. We must teach them that the cross of Christ is the ultimate example of how powerlessness wins out in the end. We must teach our children that wrestling with God will give us both a new name and a limp. That life is confusing and painful, but that God is finally on our side, and that God will not only guard us from harm, God will give us new life, new names. And we must teach our children that what sometimes looks like conflict and wrestling might just be a dance of joy. We must teach our children that true maturity is being able to live with ambiguity and confusion. This is the children's Sabbath. Today belongs to God and the children alone. And every day must be the Sabbath of the children. They are only true gift to the future. We must wrestle with them and dance with them and hold them ever close, as our very lives depended on it. Because our lives do depend on that. Our lives truly depend on wrestling and dancing and holding our children close. That matters most, and it may be all that matters. This was from Tuesday, January 14th. Finished my Christmas cards. Well, not really. I've addressed the envelopes at least. I never send Christmas cards before Christmas. This year I plan to get them out on the Feast of the Epiphany, January 6th, just at the end of the 12 days of the Christmas season. But what happened in Washington, D.C. on Epiphany shocked and angered me so much I couldn't do anything but watch the crowds committing sedition on TV. And it's been so upsetting, I couldn't calm down and write the cards until now. I don't send many cards, a couple of dozen maybe, to family and old friends. I'll get them finished tomorrow. Nothing like a Christmas greeting in mid-January. This was from Tuesday, January 12th. It's simply called My DNA. Vern and I were watching the Louis Gates show about ancestry. One of the guests was 100% Ashkenazi Jew. And I told Vern I had Ashkenazi blood. She didn't believe me, so I went online and got my ancestry reports. I am 49.3 French and German, 48.7% British and Irish, 0.8% Northwest Europe, and 0.6% Ashkenazi Jewish. And the rest, they just don't know. So there, Baron, I am a Jew. This was from Monday, January the 11th. And it again was something for years ago. It was probably about 10 or 15 years ago. I was out on the deck last night trying to convince my hard-headed coolie dog to go to the bathroom in the huge backyard rather than make me take him for a walk. Vern, the woman I'm married to, came out and started pointing to a corner of our back deck. I thought she was losing her mind and would be the first of us to go to the home. We have an active competition about that as we grow older. When I finally saw what she was motioning toward, it was a nearly full-grown possum sitting on the railing eating cat food that we put up there for our half-senile outdoor cat, Millie, so the poolie won't eat it. I took a couple of steps toward the creature and she froze in place. They really do play possum, you know. thinking that made him or her invisible. The possum stayed that way for as long as we were outside. And the pulley, great guard dog that he is, didn't even realize a feral creature was only a few feet from him. I could smell the damn thing, for God's sakes. Why didn't he? I guess Hungarian sheepdogs are genetically wired to smell wolves and bears, but not possums. But it took me back a bunch of years to a very hot summer when Mimi, my baby child, was 13 or so, and decided to sleep downstairs on a couch to try to overcome the heat. The next morning, I asked her how sleeping there had gone, and she said it was fine until the cats started chasing the possum around the room. I smiled, making her French toast and thinking we really needed air conditioning so she wouldn't have such weird dreams. Then, either that day or the day after, Bern walked past Josh's room and saw out of the corner of her eye a possum eating potato chips. She kept walking, thinking the heat had addled her brain. When she suddenly stopped and went back, the creature her heat-impaired vision had seen was nowhere to be found. Then that night, or the night after, during a storm that promised some relief from the heat, I was working on the computer when something jumped up on the back of my chair. One of the cats, I told myself, thinking I was living with at least two mentally impaired humans. But it didn't smell like a cat. It smelled a bit like slightly rotted meat and musk and something undeniably wild. When I turned around, it was the possum that by this time had been living in our house for several days. I screamed and the creature bared his sharp little teeth. We both jumped from the chair and she ran out of the room and down the hall. Armored with gardening gloves and wielding a two iron, I started searching for the creature. And flipping on the light in the guest bedroom, I saw a thick, naked tail sticking out from under the sink. I made noise and stomped the floor for no reason I can think of now, and the tail didn't move. I knelt down and peered under the cabinet, and there, rolled up like a grand white pierogi, was our house guest, playing possum. I shut the door to keep him cornered and ran to the basement to find one of our old guinea pig cages. The guinea pigs are for another telling. I entered the bathroom with trepidation to find the possum unmoved, still pretending to be dead and invisible. I put the cage on its end and opened the door. And stealing up the courage I knew was somewhere hidden in my DNA from the wilds of British Isles when my distant ancestors painted themselves blue and murdered each other without guilt. I grabbed the possum's tail, pulled him out and dropped him in the cage, slamming the door behind me. My feelings at that moment was a mixture of savage exultation and the dizziness and nausea that accompanies my standing at a great height. I had bested the invader, conquered the enemy, saved the tribe, but I was also a little sick from fear. I carried the caged possum to the front porch and went to find something for him to eat and bring him water. He had been our guest after all, and I didn't want to harm him in spite of my Braveheart blood. I gave him lettuce and carrots and risked my life by sliding a bowl of water into the cage, though he was still feigning invisibility. And when I went to have several glasses of wine and fall into a deep sleep full of dreams of repelling the Norsemen from my village and driving the Saxons out of Scotland. God, for me, is like the possums I keep running into. God always shows up in unexpected places, at times I never imagined. And like the possums, there is a wildness to God, a feral smell that at once fascinates and also repels me. The God I finally believe in is, at least around the edges, a wild and untamed God. One of my favorite hymns is titled, "There is a Wideness in God's Mercy." I must have sung the hymn 100 times before the person sitting beside me on the 100th singing told me later, you know, the word is wideness. I must have stared at him like a man staring at a possum, because he hastened to add, you were singing wildness. You were singing, there's a wildness in God mercy. It's wideness. The word is wideness. In spite of the black letters on white paper, I'd always seen them as wildness. And just me talking, I think that is more accurate for me. The mercy of God isn't merely wide, it is wild as well. Those are just a few of the things from my blog this week. I hope you enjoyed them to some extent, and I hope to see you again. It's Jim Bradley signing off from under the Castor oil tree.